It's a real pleasure to be here with you all these few days. And I want to thank Irit Khan, who I know is responsible for a lot more than my presence here, and has made a very important group of integrating lawyers from different backgrounds and communities and from Israel here together. And when I talk now about Israel, I have a really strong awareness. I'm going to talk about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state and its implications. I have a real awareness of the two perspectives. I, of course, grew up, I grew up in England as a minority, member of the minority Jewish community. I worked in Africa, in East Africa. I'll talk to you a little bit about that because it's relevant. And I went to Israel as an immigrant, and I'm now a member of Israel as a member of the majority Jewish community. So these two perspectives are very much a part of my thinking, and I'm aware of the very different sensitivities that arise in these two different contexts. So the communication is very important, and I'm really going to share with you, both the Israelis and the non-Israelis amongst you, some of my own dilemmas and concerns about the equality costs of Israel being not only a state for the self-determination of the Jewish people, but in legal and constitutional terms, a Jewish state. And I'm going to discuss, to some extent, what I feel is, what the problems are, what I feel needs doing, and why I think that these are urgent issues. Of course, Judaism is not only a religion. It is a culture, it is a nationality. We are a Jewish people, and we have a political history which is quite unique over generations, not just the Second World War, of course. The need for self-determination of the Jewish people has been recognized, of course, by the United Nations, and we have a Jewish state. And this is an extraordinarily exciting development after 2,000 years of persecution, diaspora and persecution. The concept of self-determination is deeply embedded in the United Nations human rights agenda. Israel has the right to self-determination for the Jewish people. The Jewish people have the right to self-determination in Israel. I think if I'd given this lecture 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been emphasizing that, because I think it was clear. And I think there has been a great move to delegitimize the claim of the Jewish people to self-determination in the state of Israel. And many people think that this is a development as a result of the occupation and the settlements. And to some extent, that is true. Most of the discussion about the legitimacy of Israel, for example, item 7 on the Human Rights Council's constitutional agenda. Item 7 is human rights in Israel. And item 8, as we heard in the opening discussion yesterday, item 8 is about human rights in the world. And when I try and argue in the Human Rights Council, and I have tried to discuss it with people in the Secretariat and with diplomats, why can't they remove item 7? They say Israel is an occupying state, it is a settler occupation. Some of them think it's apartheid. I mean, that word is coming up, as one knows, more and more frequently. It is a problem. I, however, do have an additional perspective. And it's this perspective that makes me, though I think that we have to answer that concern. I think we have to answer that concern because I think it is threatening for our legitimacy and sustainability as a member of the international community. But in spite of that, I also bring some cynicism to the delegitimization of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in Israel on that basis alone, because of my own personal experience, which plays a part in all our lives, The reason I became an Israeli was because I was working at the University of Dar es Salaam in East Africa as a very young lecturer, helping to set up the law school of East Africa in Dar es Salaam at the time of the Six-Day War. And on the first day of the Six-Day War, my human rights and left-wing, we didn't call them human rights in those days, incidentally, so much, it was very new, the concept of human rights. My left-wing, new left colleagues all mourned the demise of Israel on day one of the war. The only democracy in the Middle East was going to be wiped out. The remnants of the Jewish people were going to be wiped out only 25 years after the Holocaust. And on day 7, my group met again. And then the tone was different. They said, as long as Israel survives in the Middle East, exists in the Middle East, the Arabs will never reach their full cultural, political, and economic potential. So Israel had not yet become an occupying power. Israel had not yet got a single solitary settlement. But all the language that we heard in Durban in the Antiracism conference, about how many, 8 years ago is it now? I heard in Dar es Salaam in 1967 from colleagues and from students. So there is something going on here where those who have a knee-jerk reaction against the delegitimization have a point. But what feeds the delegitimization today is a genuine problem. And we lose in that not just the extreme left, but we also lose the center. And that is one of the reasons, one of the things I'm going to discuss at the end of my lecture, my presentation now. The other aspect, the two aspects of the multicultural society I'm going to discuss, the first aspect, and I'm going to spend a lot of my lecture discussing, is the internal reality of a Jewish state for Israeli citizens within the borders of Israel. The constitutional area of Israel. And it's called a multiculturalist. This conference refers to the multiculturalist. Sorry, this conference is talking about the multiculturalist society. Well, multiculturalism means more than just Jews and Arabs. And I'm going to go through the costs, the equality costs of the legal definition of Israel as a Jewish state. There is, as Justice Gibran said yesterday, a great deal of positive coexistence, vibrant democracy, and freedom of expression in Israel. And it is, in those ways, a very good place to live. But there are enormous equality costs, which I'm going to present to you as being urgently in need of change. Firstly, I'll talk about the constitutional costs. Secondly, I'll talk about the costs on a legal, public, and political level. And thirdly, I'll talk about the relationship between Jews and Arabs. So those are the three aspects of the equality costs I want to discuss. Firstly, we saw the Kelsian pyramid, with the constitution being the Grundnorm, the foundational norm of society. It's a kind of, this constitutional norm, it's a kind of citizenship identity card in some ways. It tells us what kind of society we're all going to live in. In this respect, Israel is regionally placed. Like the Muslim world around us, Judaism is written into the constitutional, basic, fundamental norms of the society. There are those who argue whether we have a constitution or don't, whether the basic laws are a constitution or not. That's not the place, this is not the place for me to discuss it. I think it's a partial constitution. But our basic laws of human rights, such as they are, call Israel, or put fundamental value of Israel as being a Jewish and democratic state. And the only other constitutions which use a religiously or potentially religious identification as part of their constitutions are the Muslim states, where they are Islamic republics or Arab republics in which Sharia is a fundamental value of the constitutional regime. It's not the same when you talk about France or Italy. This is not potentially a religious definition. Now, a Jewish and democratic state could actually be similar to Italian or French, but the Jewish element in Jewish and democratic is quite clearly given, in part, a Jewish religious complexion, and it's almost inevitable that it will be so. So in that sense, it is more like Islam or Sharia than it is like French or Italian. The result in the Israeli constitutional laws, which are very honest about their purpose, is that the right to equality is not included. It is a missing right on the constitutional level. This is extremely serious. It is not some kind, it cannot be just ignored or marginalized or minimalized. It is of fundamental importance. Constitutions, as I said, are citizenship identity cards. They are also a basis for education. People are educated to their constitutional rights. We've never seen it more openly, or more obviously than in the United States, where it's become a kind of almost constitutional religion, it's called, but I don't think it's like a religion. It's a constitutional citizenship which binds people together on an equal basis of calling the state a Jewish and democratic state and allowing the Jewish religious lobby to exclude the right to equality from our constitutional documents. The treaty bodies, that's CEDAW, I sat on CEDAW at one stage, which is the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the Human Rights Committee, which is a treaty body, and my own working group, the working group to which I now belong in the Human Rights Council, repeatedly say that all forms of human rights must be given constitutional force in every state. That is the basis for the international human rights community, that the constitutional principle must endorse human rights, and equality is the primary the key human right. It's the key to all the other human rights. Now, we do have human dignity in our basic laws, and the Supreme Court, as Justice Gibran said yesterday, has had a wonderfully positive impact in interpreting human dignity as incorporating the principle of equality. But it is not absolute, it does not cover everything, as I will show you. It does not cover all aspects of our lives. Not only that, but the fact that it is the Supreme Court which has been left with the job of including equality in human dignity has exposed the Supreme Court to attacks on grounds of judicial activism. And one of the reasons is that they say, you know, the Supreme Court can't legislate human rights. It is the Constitutional Council or the Constitutive Assembly or the Constituent Assembly or the Knesset which must legislate these human rights. And equality, as I say, is a missing right. And so this has, in my view, unnecessarily exposed the Supreme Court to political dangers to which we should not have exposed the Supreme Court. Because it is the job of the political will of the whole community in Israel which must say equality is our calling card. That is part, in my view, of the experience of the Jewish people, as well as the demand of the international human rights community. Now, what about the costs on legal, public and political levels? As we move from the constitutional to the concrete examples of the way in which the equality costs affect our lives. Well, firstly, the personal law. Well, we heard the personal law does not have an equality cost between the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in Israel. But it does indeed have an equality cost under all three of those religions, as was pointed out this morning in this excellent and interesting lecture, which we heard from Alberto. Within the Jewish religion, there's inequality because Reform and Conservative Jews are not recognized as having the same status as Orthodox Jewry. But I would say an even greater cost is the cost for women under the personal laws of all three of the religions. We saw this very encouraging photograph of the religious leaders who wanted to visit Israel at the beginning of the lecture. And of course it is a very welcome initiative. But I wonder if anybody else looked at that photograph and thought of the subliminal message in that photograph. It is not by accident that it was all male. Okay? We have a problem. We have a real problem, both with the leadership, the interpretation, and the application of the laws of all three of the monotheisms. These are male institutions, both in terms of personnel, leadership, concept, and application. And when we heard that Bagatz supervises the decisions of the religious courts in all three communities, they supervise it, Bagatz supervises these decisions on a very marginal level. I want to give you an example of one case in which the court felt it couldn't intervene, where the Grand Rabbinical Court overturned a regional rabbinical court's decision to oblige a man to divorce his wife. Heaven forbid not to actually divorce her, but just to oblige the man to divorce his wife, because under Jewish law, there is no divorce possible unless the man says, "So I wish it." And so the regional court said, obliged him to divorce her because he had a new family, because he was accused of violence. The Grand Rabbinical Court reversed that decision, and the Supreme Court, with Justice Chesed, saying that the fate of a woman under Jewish law is worse than that of a Hebrew slave, because a Hebrew slave is released after 6 years, and she, the woman, was not released after 6 years. Nevertheless, Chesed, like as the other two judges, says, we cannot intervene. This is a statutory jurisdiction of the Rabbinical Court. We cannot intervene. So that it is a limited power of Bagatz to supervise the fundamental rights of individuals under the religious courts in Israel. Now, there is a problem with army service. Army service, which is causing 83% of the public in Israel think that those who are in yeshivas, studying in yeshivas, should do army or civil service. Yes, the Supreme Court has finally, after a 30-year battle, ping-pong between the Supreme Court and the Knesset, where the Supreme Court refused to intervene in the exemption of religious youth from army service. Finally, the Supreme Court has had it said, and the Supreme Court has said that the religious must serve. But that said, this was a decision in February and has caused a great deal of social unrest to know that a considerably significant sector of the community does not share the defense burden. Women in the political sphere. There are religious parties in Israel which will not have women on their candidates lists. And the Knesset, the public purse, funds those political parties to run in Knesset elections. There is a recent European Court of Justice's decision which has said that Belgium must not fund a confessional party which refuses to have women on its list of political candidates. I am involved with groups in Israel which are fighting to stop the funding of political parties, religious parties in Israel, or political parties of any colour, doesn't have to be religious, which discriminate openly against half of the population. There was a recent statement by a religious leader who was who has been to university, has served in the army, and came out with a statement that women should neither be allowed to elect or be elected in Israel. That was 2 weeks ago. So this is a situation that is not static, it's worsening in some ways. What about women in the public sphere? I represented the women of the wall who wanted to pray by the kotel with talit and out loud from the Torah. In the women's section, they were Orthodox women. They are Orthodox women. They continue to be Orthodox women. 2 weeks ago, Anat Hoffman, there was an agreement after the Supreme Court first decided 3 judges in favour of our petition. There was an additional hearing, and the Supreme Court then said, you know, the majority of the court said, let's move the women, these Orthodox women who want to pray in a way that is accepted in many Orthodox synagogues, to Robertson's Arch, which is adjacent to the area where Jews from all over the world come to pray. And they said if within a year there's not a suitable praying area in Robinson's Arch, then they can return and pray according to their manner in the women's section of the kotel. The police agreed to allow them not to pray out loud from the Torah, but to wear a talit in the form of a scarf, because there were special scarves that the women of the wall had in pursuit of the Supreme Court judgment. And Anat Hoffman was wearing her talit, and they said it was too much like a talit rather than a scarf. Instead of being like this, it kind of extended a little over her shoulders, and so they arrested her. It's not the first time that they've arrested women of the wall. They arrested her and she said, I want to be put before a judge. This is absurd. And so they said, oh, you can go before a judge. They handcuffed her and footcuffed her, threw her into jail for the night, and said, you'll see a judge tomorrow. There's no judge available tonight. You would think the police had something better to do. There has not actually been a disturbance of the peace as a result of the women of the wall for quite some time. And the women of the wall were asking to enhance the position of women in Orthodox Judaism in the 20th and 21st centuries. They wanted to contribute. It's very unfortunate that the Supreme Court decided to reject, on a constitutional level, this egalitarian use of public space, which is of such enormous symbolic importance, not only to Jews in Israel, but to Jews elsewhere. And it is received very badly, I may say, by American and Canadian Jews, the decision of the Supreme Court. It's not only women's voices by the kotel in a so-called religious environment. Women are not allowed to sing in the army choir in Knesset functions. When the army was supposed to sing at the inauguration of President Weizmann, they were suddenly told they must come without the girls' soldiers, because the religious parties in the Knesset object to hearing women's voices in prayer. I phoned Naomi Chazan, who was then a member of Knesset for the Meretz Party, and said, you have to do something about this. This is an extension of the negative message given by the Supreme Court's decision on the women of the wall. And she said, oh, we've solved it. Don't worry. We agree. It's terrible. What's the solution? The army choir will not sing at the inauguration of the president at all. Neither the men nor the women. Since then, there has been a developing insistence of religious recruits to have units in the army which are women-free. Women are excluded from units in the army at the request of religious recruits. There are also arguments going on all the time about whether women can sing at army functions and whether religious recruits, conscripted soldiers, are allowed to walk out of any function in which women's voices, girl soldiers' voices are heard. This is extremely problematic. 64% of the public, including 56% of the religious public, think that segregation between men and women should be a criminal offence. The homosexual, the LGBT community has done quite well in spite of the missing equality clause in the Constitutional Bill of Rights. I won't even go into it now, but it's considered the Israeli law is progressive on LGBT rights, and the Supreme Court has allowed gay marches, in Jerusalem against the objection of religious elements, and Tel Aviv is considered #1 gay city in the world. So we'll leave that as being a non-problematic area of equality costs in the Israeli system. Education has an enormous equality cost. The core syllabus, the independent religious schools have refused to use the core syllabus, which is maths, science, civics, English, the things which adapt every member of every child to function and participate in a modern society, which incidentally under the Children's Rights Convention is an obligation of the state. The Supreme Court said it was unacceptable to fund schooling which did not include the core syllabus. But the Knesset came back and re-legislated and said, we will fund schools which do not teach the core syllabus. And then, again, liberal groups came back and they are now challenging the law which justifies the funding of schools that do not have a core syllabus. This is a big problem not only of educational inequality, but of economic inequality, which comes after that educational inequality. We are leaving out a whole section of the population from the modern economic state of Israel. Now some yeshiva students, it's the second time that it's happened, are actually seeking damages against the state for not giving them an adequate education to allow them to participate in a modern society. The secular, 71% of the public think that the secular Orthodox rift in Israel is the most severe rift in Israeli society today. These are, I can give you the polls afterwards. I had problems with adapting my computer to the system here. Anyway, relations between Jews and Arabs. I will take 5 minutes, if I may, just to conclude on this, the relations between Jews and Arabs. Firstly, within the State of Israel, and secondly, as regards the relations between the State of Israel and its Palestinian neighbor. Firstly, within the State of Israel, yes, there are no equality costs in terms of the prohibition of discrimination against Arabs in Israel. They are included, they were included later than women. It took time to do it, but they're included in all the non-discrimination legislation as individuals. There is affirmative action for women, for Arabs, for Ethiopians, and for the disabled in those areas in which there's affirmative action at all, which is public service, government companies. There is affirmative action. The Supreme Court has been very active and very progressive in talking about the equal rights to all kinds of budget allocations, to representation on public bodies which allocate budgets. The Supreme Court has done an excellent job on this. There are also collective rights for Arabs. There are collective rights in terms of the personal law. I've talked about the feminist costs of the personal law. But in terms of the inter-religious costs, there are. The Arab communities have autonomy, Muslim and Christian, as do the religious courts. I don't like the whole system, but within that system, there's equality between the three communities. There are collective rights in terms of exemption from army service, which on the whole has been a joint interest of the Muslim community and of the government. There are collective rights in education, and Arabs may have either their own school system or attend Hebrew education. There is not enough autonomy in terms of determining the curriculum in Arab schools. Political representation is vibrant and free, and I would say that some of the Arab Knesset members they all have freedom of expression. Some of them have used it to promote extremely radical positions on the stage of the Knesset. So one cannot in any way criticize this as an equality cost of the Jewish state. However, the public attitude to the Arab minority has deteriorated. It has deteriorated, and there's far more evidence of racist attitudes than there ever used to be in Israel. Part of it can be attributed to the conflict, to the period of the Second Intifada and terrorism, but whatever it can be attributed to, it is something that has to be fought and eliminated. Israel, as a Jewish community, as well as a democratic state, cannot afford these kind of attitudes and has to do more to uproot them. And coming back to law, which is not just public, the constitutional identity I talked about. Constitutional identity should be a shared identity between Jews and Arabs in Israel. Israel is and it was signed by 20 civil rights organizations in Israel and by Masawa, which is an organization for equal rights for Arabs in Israel. I think it's the only constitutional document which has been signed by both Jewish and Arab organizations, or even individuals, as a blueprint for a shared future, a shared constitutional future. And that is what I think the State of Israel should be moving towards. That shared constitutional future is dependent on two-state solution. The two-state solution is being persistently shelved, and I'm not here to attribute blame. I am here to say that it is in the essence of our justification for being a Jewish and democratic state that we manage to reach a two-state solution. Because if we cannot reach a two-state solution, the ultimate price will be apartheid. Because, yes, I know it's a terrible, the thing that stops Israel being named as an apartheid state is the fact, or is the assertion and fact, that the Jewish state, or the Israeli part of the state, intends to have a two-state solution. Because the minute that it is maintenance of racial superiority over another group, it turns into apartheid. Israel cannot deny the vote to millions of Arabs on a long-term basis without it being named apartheid under international law. And therefore, all the red lights should be flashing that it is in Israel's absolute prime, essential, crucial interest to promote a two-state solution with all the energy at its resources. Thank you.